She built a $2.8 million mansion on my dead grandfather's land and charged guests $500 to swim in my lake. Here's what entitlement looks like. An infinity pool carved into pristine Montana shoreline, helicopter landing pad where century-old oak trees used to stand, and a pharmaceutical heiress sipping Dom Perignon on a dock that extends 40 feet into water my family's protected since 1987. The acrid smell of wet concrete now chokes out morning air that used to carry nothing but pine sap and lake mist. Heavy machinery beeps at sunrise, drowning out loons whose families have nested here longer than mine. Gravel crunches under the wheels of luxury cars, parking on land where my great-uncle once fed deer by hand. When I showed Vivian Sterling Hayes my inheritance papers, she laughed and said, "That old hermit's dead, sweetheart. I'm improving this wasteland." Big mistake, because what she didn't know about that old hermit cost her everything. $3.2 million, to be exact. Ready to see entitled wealth get demolished? Drop a if you love justice served cold, and tell me where you're watching from. My name's Bryson McCall, and 3 months ago, I was just another Army logistics coordinator trying to figure out what to do with my life after 8 years of moving equipment through Afghan mountain passes. Then my great-uncle Hank died, and suddenly I owned more land than some European countries. Hank was the family legend, the guy who bought 1,700 acres of Montana wilderness with his VA loan back in 1987 and told civilization to kiss his ass. While the rest of us were chasing careers and credit scores, he was living in a 1940s fishing lodge, hand-feeding deer every morning at exactly 6 a.m. Family thought he'd cracked. Turns out, he was the only one who understood what really mattered. His will came with a philosophy. Keep it wild, keep it free, never let the suits carve it up. Along with those words came Crystal Lake. Water so pristine you could read a newspaper through 20 feet of it, plus 3 rustic cabins and enough untouched wilderness to make a park ranger propose marriage. The assessed value? $4.2 million. My inheritance? Priceless. I drove up from Denver expecting to find Hank's rustic paradise, and maybe some decent fishing. What I found was paradise, all right, with a snake already in it. The snake had a name, Vivian Sterling Hayes, 52, fresh off a pharmaceutical divorce that scored her more money than most small nations' GDP, and possessed by an unholy mission to civilize everything within a 50-mile radius. My first hint something was wrong hit me before I even got out of my truck. The morning air, which should have carried nothing but pine needles and lake mist, reeked of diesel exhaust and wet concrete. The gentle lapping of water against the dock was drowned out by the mechanical beeping of heavy machinery and the angry whine of chainsaws murdering trees that had been standing since before Montana was a state. I grabbed my binoculars, old habit from the Army, and surveyed the damage. Where Hank's favorite oak grove used to cast shadows across the water, there was now a construction zone that looked like someone had dropped a strip mine into Eden. Massive earth movers, concrete mixers, and a crew of workers who'd clearly been busy turning my pristine shoreline into their personal gravel pit. But here's what really burned my biscuits. They were using my boat launch on my property, to ferry supplies across the lake for their illegal construction project. Time for a neighborly conversation. The site foreman, a sun-weathered guy named Pete, looked like he'd rather wrestle a grizzly than answer my questions. When I introduced myself as the new McCall, his face went pale. "You're Henry's kin." He glanced nervously toward the mansion rising like a concrete tumor from the hillside. Lady didn't mention no family. That's when Vivian Sterling Hayes made her entrance, emerging from a pristine Range Rover like some designer-clad fairy godmother of destruction. She wore hiking boots that had never seen dirt, and carried herself with the kind of entitled confidence that comes from believing your bank account makes you immune to consequences. "You must be Henry's nephew," she said, skipping handshakes entirely. Such a tragedy how he let this magnificent property rot away. I pointed out that her workers were trespassing on my land and dumping construction debris in protected wetlands. Her response was to unfurl a crisp new survey across her car hood. "Oh, sweetie, I'm afraid you're mistaken." She tapped the paper with a manicured nail. "This survey clearly shows the boat launch within my property boundaries. I had it done professionally just 6 months ago." Poor Henry was quite confused about boundaries in his final years. The paper still smelled like fresh ink, and I knew it was fraudulent. Hank had walked me along every boundary marker when I was 12, teaching me to read the forest like a map. But Vivian wasn't finished destroying my day. She casually mentioned filing a harassment complaint against me with the county. "Sheriff Peterson and I are tennis partners," she smiled, with all the warmth of a loan shark. "He's very concerned about unstable veterans bothering respectable residents." Standing there, tasting humiliation bitter as burnt coffee, watching my family's legacy being carved up by someone who thought money trumped history, I felt something cold and tactical click into place. She wanted to play power games with someone who'd spent 8 years outfoxing Taliban bomb makers? Perfect. Let's see how her country club strategies worked against military-grade patients. 2 weeks later, I discovered that Vivian Sterling Hayes didn't just think big, she thought criminally big. Maggie Blair's law office still smelled like the Texaco station it used to be, back when she bought it for $3,000 in 1987. At 78, Maggie chain smokes Marlboros, uses a manual typewriter that sounds like automatic weapons fire, and charges $75 an hour because she believes justice shouldn't require a second mortgage. The woman's a Montana legend. "Honey," she said, sliding a stack of papers across her oil-stained desk while her ancient coffee percolator gurgled like a dying engine, "your pharmaceutical princess makes Al Capone look honest." The permits made my vision blur with rage. Vivian had somehow obtained county approval for a 12,000-square-foot lakefront mansion, complete with guest house, helicopter pad, and private marina. Her building permit listed her lot size as 47 acres. Her actual property? 12 acres. She'd casually included 35 acres of my inheritance in her official building plans, like adding extra cheese to a pizza order. "Back in law school," I told Maggie, "they taught us that adverse possession requires 20 years of continuous, hostile occupation." I'd done some late-night research after our first meeting. 18 months of trespassing doesn't qualify you for a parking space, much less half my property. Maggie cackled and lit cigarette number 4 of the hour. "You've been studying, boy. That's exactly right." But here's what really made my blood boil. The signature on those fraudulent permits belonged to County Commissioner Dale Hutchins, the same Dale Hutchins whose campaign photos showed him arm in arm with Vivian at the country club's charity auction. While I was processing this small-town corruption masterpiece, my trail camera sent me a video that made my hands shake. Vivian's crew had started digging the mansion's foundation, 50 feet onto my side of the property line. Heavy machinery was chewing up soil where Hank used to grow tomatoes and teach me to identify deer tracks. I hired Jensen Surveying that afternoon. They're the most respected boundary firm in 3 counties, and they use ground-penetrating radar that can find a lost wedding ring buried in a football field. What they discovered made Vivian's whole scheme crumble like stale cookies. The original 1987 brass boundary markers, each one driven 4 feet into solid bedrock by Hank's surveyor, were exactly where my great-uncle had shown me during our walks. Vivian's landscaping crew had simply buried them under 6 inches of imported topsoil and decorative river stones, like hiding evidence under a pretty tablecloth. I filed an emergency injunction at 3 p.m., complete with GPS coordinates, photographs, and Jensen's sworn affidavit. By 5 p.m., I had a court order demanding immediate cessation of all construction activities. That's when Vivian revealed her true nature, and it was uglier than roadkill in August. Instead of complying with the court order, she unleashed her legal attack dogs. Her lawyer, some slick-haired shark from Billings, filed a restraining order, claiming I was a mentally unstable veteran, exhibiting threatening behavior toward innocent construction workers. The restraining order was signed by Judge Harrison Mills, who happened to be Dale Hutchins' weekly golf partner and the former law associate of Vivian's divorce attorney. In small Montana towns, everyone's connected by either marriage, money, or mutual corruption. Here's the twist that would have been hilarious if it wasn't destroying my life. Sheriff Peterson, Vivian's twice-weekly tennis partner, had to personally serve me with papers that legally banned me from my own property. Standing on land my family had protected for 38 years, this overweight wannabe tough guy handed me documents that made me a criminal for defending my inheritance. The irony tasted like copper pennies and diesel exhaust. "Nothing personal, McCall," Peterson wheezed, clearly uncomfortable with his role as Vivian's personal enforcer. "Just following the law." "Whose law?" I asked, watching sweat stain his uniform despite the cool mountain air. "The county's law, or the country club's?" His face flushed red as a stop sign, but he had no answer. That evening, I stood behind yellow police tape that fluttered like surrender flags in the mountain breeze, watching million-dollar construction equipment devour earth that had never been disturbed by anything heavier than rabbit paws. Floodlights transformed my family's sacred wilderness into a harsh industrial nightmare, washing out constellations Hank used to name during our camping trips. The sound of diesel engines grinding through the night, mixed with the crack of century-old pines being felled, creating a mechanical symphony that made my chest tight with helpless fury. Vivian's crew was working triple overtime, racing to pour concrete before my legal challenges could gain traction. But I remembered something crucial from Afghanistan. The enemy's greatest strength often becomes their fatal weakness. Vivian's confidence in her money and connections was making her reckless. She was building her dream mansion, like someone who believed the law was just another service she could purchase. What she didn't realize was that I'd been reading environmental law until 2 a.m. every night since this war began, and I'd found something in those federal statutes that was going to turn her concrete paradise into a very expensive pile of rubble. The next morning, I woke up to discover I'd become Glacier County's most infamous, dangerous veteran, starring in Vivian Sterling Hayes' one-woman social media horror show. My phone buzzed like an angry hornet, with notifications from a Facebook page called Concerned Citizens for Lake Safety, created overnight and already boasting 300 members. The featured video showed me walking along my own shoreline, checking trail cameras I'd installed to document the illegal construction. But Vivian's caption spun a different tale. Local veteran with documented PTSD issues repeatedly stalks innocent construction workers. How many red flags do we need? The comments section reeked of manufactured outrage, worse than a feedlot in July. Strangers who'd never laid eyes on me were playing armchair psychiatrist, suggesting I be committed before someone gets hurt. My morning coffee turned to acid in my stomach as I read people debating whether I was another veteran time bomb waiting to explode. But Vivian's character assassination campaign was just getting warmed up. She'd been hosting elegant wine and cheese gatherings for the lake's newer residents, California and Seattle transplants, who'd moved here seeking authentic Montana, but wanted it with organic groceries and reliable Wi-Fi. At these sophisticated little soirees, she spread poison disguised as concerned neighbor gossip. Ruby Blackwater filled me in on Vivian's propaganda techniques. Ruby's 67, a retired tribal council member who owns 400 acres next to mine, and has a bullshit detector calibrated to NASA precision. That pharmaceutical princess has a tongue slicker than a used car salesman in a rainstorm, Ruby told me over coffee at Murphy's Diner, where the vinyl booths still smelled like cigarettes despite Montana's smoking ban. Kept calling your great-uncle that eccentric hermit who never respected proper boundaries. Had the audacity to suggest you inherited legally questionable land rights. Ruby's weathered hands gripped her coffee mug like she was strangling someone's neck. Told her my family's been neighbors with McCalls since before this was even a territory. That wiped the smirk off her Botoxed face real quick. While Vivian poisoned the social media well, her mainstream media manipulation hit new depths of shamelessness. The Glacier County Gazette ran a front-page story that made my blood pressure spike. Veteran harasses respected businesswoman over boundary dispute. The reporter, some eager kid fresh out of journalism school, who probably thought investigative reporting meant copying press releases, had never contacted me for comment. The entire article was Vivian's version of reality, painting her as a visionary entrepreneur, improving the community, while being terrorized by an unstable former soldier with documented anger issues. Here's what really made my teeth grind. Flipping to page 6 revealed a full-page advertisement for Sterling Hayes Properties, featuring glossy photos of luxury lakefront developments, coming soon to Crystal Lake's pristine wilderness. Vivian wasn't just the paper's biggest advertiser. She was planning to transform our entire area into Disneyland for rich people. But my late-night research sessions were paying dividends that would make her advertising budget look like pocket change. Buried in federal environmental regulations, knowledge I'd acquired the same way I'd learned to navigate Afghan supply chains, through obsessive attention to bureaucratic details, I discovered something beautiful. Vivian had skipped the required environmental impact study for her waterfront construction. Her illegal dock jutted 40 feet into navigable waters, violating the Clean Water Act every single day. The penalty structure was deliciously specific: $37,500 per day of violation. She'd been in violation for 63 days. That's $2,362,500 in potential federal fines, enough to buy her mansion and then demolish it for fun. Even better, I documented her concrete washout flowing directly into protected wetlands where endangered freshwater mussels lived. Harming endangered species isn't just expensive, it's criminal. Maria Santos at the EPA's Denver office had dealt with environmental criminals before. Her voice carried the cold authority of someone who'd spent years watching rich people discover that money can't buy exemptions from federal law. Mr. McCall, if your documentation is accurate, we're looking at multiple federal violations that bypass local jurisdiction entirely. We'll have investigators on site within the week. That afternoon brought the mini twist that confirmed just how deep this corruption ran. The county zoning board called an emergency meeting to approve a variance for Vivian's slightly oversized mansion. 3 of the 5 board members belonged to her country club, and they voted unanimously to retroactively change our area's zoning from agricultural preserve to residential estate. My new property tax assessment arrived the next day, like an eviction notice wrapped in official letterhead. Annual taxes had jumped from $1,200 to $5,280, a 340% increase designed to financially strangle me off land I couldn't afford to keep. But sitting on Hank's weathered porch that evening, breathing mountain air still poisoned with diesel exhaust and the chalky dust of pulverized limestone, I felt something cold and tactical settle in my chest. The rhythmic beeping of construction equipment had become a countdown timer, measuring the days until federal law came calling. Vivian thought she was fighting a small-town property dispute with a broken veteran who'd crumble under pressure. What she didn't realize was that environmental crimes are federal jurisdiction. The EPA doesn't care about tennis partnerships or wine club memberships. Federal environmental law is like physics. It applies equally to everyone, and rich people hit the ground just as hard when they fall. Vivian Sterling Hayes had moved beyond reputation destruction. Now she wanted to financially strangle me until I begged to sell my birthright for whatever pocket change she offered. Her opening salvo arrived via process server at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, delivered by a sweating kid who apologized 4 times before shoving legal papers into my hands like they were contaminated. Vivian was suing me for $500,000 in construction delays and associated damages, claiming my malicious legal interference had cost her contractor fees, equipment rental, and lost revenue from her planned executive retreat destination. The lawsuit was thicker than a Denver phone book and written in legalese designed to make normal people wet themselves. Her attack dog, Bradford Ashworth, an $800 per hour legal piranha from Billings, who wore handmade Italian suits that cost more than most people's annual salary, demanded I pay for professional mediation with an arbitrator of their choosing. Translation: surrender immediately or we'll drain your bank account 1 billable hour at a time. But Vivian's financial warfare was just warming up, like a sadist selecting torture instruments. My construction loan, previously pre-approved by First Montana Bank to restore Hank's fishing lodge, vanished faster than free beer at a college party. The loan officer stammered through an explanation that sounded like he was reading hostage demands. Property boundary disputes make the land unsuitable collateral, he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. New bank policy, effective immediately. Funny how new bank policy coincided with Dr. Richard Hayes, Vivian's pharmaceutical executive ex-husband, sitting on First Montana's board of directors. Small world, smaller ethics. That afternoon delivered a bureaucratic gut punch that made my vision blur. The county was threatening to condemn my property as abandoned and deteriorating, claiming Hank's 1940s cabins violated current building codes. I had 30 days to modernize 3 rustic structures or face seizure through eminent domain. The inspection notice, signed by the same building inspector who'd rubber-stamped Vivian's fraudulent permits, demanded upgrades totaling $80,000. Electrical systems, septic improvements, structural reinforcements that would destroy the historical character Hank had spent decades preserving. While I was absorbing this financial sucker punch, Vivian unveiled her masterpiece of neighborhood manipulation, a Crystal Lake Beautification Committee dedicated to establishing the area's first homeowners association. There had never been an HOA. The lake had been home to independent property owners for over a century, ranchers, retirees, and rebels who'd moved here specifically to escape suburban conformity and bureaucratic tyranny. But Vivian's proposed HOA would impose mandatory annual fees of $15,000 for professional lake management and aesthetic enhancement. The fine print granted the HOA board authority to approve or deny any property modifications, essentially giving Vivian veto power over whether I could repair Hank's cabins or operate any business. Maggie Blair nearly choked on her cigarette when I showed her the HOA proposal. "Honey, this woman's trying to turn a mountain lake into a gated community for rich assholes. It's like putting a tuxedo on a grizzly bear. Technically possible, but it pisses off the bear." But here's where Vivian's financial pressure campaign backfired with the force of a misfiring cannon. While researching her background to defend against the lawsuit, I discovered something that made my lawyer training from the Army JAG office tingle with anticipation. Sterling Hayes Pharmaceuticals had been hammered with a $12 million federal fine for systematic Medicare fraud. The company had overcharged government insurance programs for generic medications, funneling profits through shell companies, while Vivian served as Director of Strategic Development, a fancy title for chief money launderer. Her divorce settlement included a 10-year ban from healthcare-related businesses due to her central role in the fraud scheme. Vivian wasn't just ethically bankrupt. She was a convicted federal criminal trying to rebrand herself as a legitimate businesswoman. Even more damning, I'd uncovered her systematic campaign to acquire lakefront properties through regulatory harassment. 6 other longtime owners had received her generous offers to sell. When they declined, they'd all faced mysterious bureaucratic problems: false EPA violations, bogus building citations, and property tax assessments that tripled overnight. Ruby Blackwater had been target number 4. That pharmaceutical vulture offered me 3 times market value for land my great-grandfather homesteaded, Ruby told me over coffee, that tasted like motor oil, but carried the honest flavor of unvarnished truth. When I explained our family cemetery wasn't for sale, suddenly, EPA inspectors claimed I was dumping toxic waste. The toxic waste was a rain barrel Ruby used for her vegetable garden. One phone call resolved the investigation, but the harassment pattern was crystal clear. That evening, sitting on Hank's weathered porch while concrete mixers rumbled like mechanical thunder across the lake, I breathed air thick with limestone dust that settled on my skin like industrial snow. The relentless grinding of construction equipment had become the soundtrack to my family's potential extinction. But my research had uncovered something beautiful. Medicare fraud convictions create permanent legal vulnerabilities that money can't erase. Any civil lawsuit filed by someone with federal fraud history triggers enhanced scrutiny from government investigators, especially when it involves suspicious property acquisition patterns. Vivian thought she was crushing me financially until I'd collapse. What she didn't realize was that her criminal past had handed me a federal-sized sledgehammer to swing at her glass mansion. 3 weeks into my caffeine-fueled legal research marathon, hunched over Hank's dining table at 2 a.m., with coffee that tasted like battery acid and determination that burned hotter than a rocket engine, I found the smoking gun that would obliterate Vivian's entire criminal empire. It was hiding in a manila folder labeled Mineral Rights, 1987, nearly overlooked while sorting through Hank's obsessively organized estate papers. My great-uncle had documented everything with military precision, keeping every deed, survey, and contract in chronological order, like classified mission files. The 1987 mineral rights deed made my pulse spike like I'd discovered buried treasure. Hank's property included subsurface rights to gravel, limestone, and something called recreational water access privileges. But the real dynamite was buried in the fine print, a reversion clause written with laser-guided specificity. If the property was ever used for commercial development, ownership would automatically revert to Glacier County for public recreational use. Vivian's social media addiction had become her legal suicide note. For 2 months, she'd been plastering Instagram and Facebook with advertisements for her exclusive corporate retreat venue, charging executives $5,000 per weekend to experience authentic Montana luxury at Sterling Hayes Estate. Her posts featured champagne-soaked business leaders toasting deals while overlooking our private lake sanctuary. Commercial development, exactly what the reversion clause prohibited with biblical finality. But the revelations kept exploding like an ammunition depot catching fire. County records revealed that Commissioner Dale Hutchins owned shares in Mountain Vista Development LLC, the same company holding a purchase option on Vivian's property for a massive resort complex. The entire lake area was earmarked for rezoning as a premium recreational destination, transforming our protected wilderness into a country club for pharmaceutical millionaires and tech moguls. Vivian wasn't building a mansion. She was establishing the beachhead for a development invasion designed to pave over everything Hank had spent his life protecting. The environmental violations weren't accidents. They were systematic habitat destruction, designed to eliminate the natural features that gave our area its protected status. Kill the endangered species, contaminate the pristine water, and suddenly there's no environmental justification for preventing commercial development. Ruby Blackwater's revelation about treaty rights turned this into a federal case with nuclear implications. My great-great-grandfather signed fishing treaties with the U.S. government in 1862, Ruby explained over breakfast at Murphy's Diner, where the smell of honest bacon grease mixed with the sweeter aroma of justice being prepared to order. Any development affecting water quality requires mandatory tribal consultation. Your pharmaceutical princess never even sent us a postcard. Treaty violations aren't parking tickets. They're federal crimes that can void all related permits and land transactions retroactively, like hitting a legal reset button with a federal sledgehammer. Maggie Blair nearly choked on her morning cigarette when I showed her the reversion clause. Holy shit, honey. This woman built a $2.8 million mansion on land that legally belongs to the county the moment she charges rent. She's been advertising her own eviction for months. The final piece clicked when my water quality tests revealed Vivian's concrete washout had poisoned Crystal Lake with heavy metals, at levels 300% above federal drinking water standards. Her contractor had been dumping construction debris directly into protected wetlands, creating an environmental crime scene that stretched across 40 acres of destroyed habitat. The Endangered Species Act violations alone carried penalties of $50,000 per dead mussel, with potential prison sentences for willful destruction of protected ecosystems. I'd counted over 200 dead shells along the contaminated shoreline. Sitting in Hank's kitchen at sunrise, surrounded by legal documents that would vaporize Vivian's criminal enterprise, I breathed morning air that finally carried the clean scent of pine needles instead of diesel exhaust. The construction had mysteriously stopped overnight. Word travels fast in small towns. Vivian had invested $8 million in a mansion she couldn't legally own, built on land that wasn't legally hers, using development plans that violated federal laws with the precision of a guided missile hitting a target. The reversion clause wasn't just going to cost her the mansion. It was going to expose a corruption network that would make headlines from Montana to Washington, D.C. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting that would either save Crystal Lake or land us all in federal prison for conspiracy against a pharmaceutical heiress with more lawyers than Montana has cattle. The location was Hank's fire pit, rebuilt from stones he'd collected during 40 years of morning walks. The smell of burning pine logs mixed with something sweeter, the scent of carefully planned justice being seasoned to perfection. Maggie Blair arrived first, her ancient briefcase held together with duct tape and 3 decades of legal victories. Ruby Blackwater rumbled up in her Ford pickup that had more miles than the International Space Station, followed by 6 other property owners who'd received Vivian's generous offers and subsequent bureaucratic terrorism. "Folks," I said, watching sparks dance toward stars finally visible without construction floodlights washing out the sky. "We're not fighting one entitled pharmaceutical princess. We're taking on a criminal conspiracy that stretches from our corrupt county commissioner to federal environmental crimes." Maggie had spent the evening burning up phone lines to her former colleague, Janet Morrison, a federal prosecutor in Denver, who specialized in putting environmental criminals in orange jumpsuits. Janet's response had been swift and merciless. "She's sending a federal task force," Maggie announced, lighting what would be the first of many cigarettes during our war council. "FBI, EPA, Interior Department investigators with search warrants and attitudes. They'll be here Monday morning, ready to seize everything from construction equipment to bank records." Our strategy crystallized like frost forming on a windshield. 3 coordinated strikes that would hit Vivian's operation with the precision of a surgical missile. The legal blitzkrieg: file federal lawsuits under environmental statutes that carry both criminal and civil penalties. Back in Afghanistan, I'd learned that the best way to defeat an enemy with superior resources is to choose battlefields where their advantages become liabilities. Federal environmental law doesn't care about country club connections or pharmaceutical money. Violation is violation, and rich people fall just as hard. The documentation assault. Ruby's tribal council would trigger federal oversight through treaty rights that predate Montana statehood. This wasn't just about stopping one mansion. It would require federal environmental impact studies for any future development threatening treaty waters. The media siege. Environmental journalists salivate over stories featuring rich criminals destroying pristine wilderness, especially when there's a military veteran defending his family's legacy against pharmaceutical corruption. Tom Erickson, a retired rancher whose weathered hands could repair anything from barbed wire to broken hearts, had been documenting Vivian's systematic harassment. She offered me double market value for land my grandfather proved up in 1923, he said, feeding another log to flames that crackled like righteous fury. When I explained that some things ain't for sale, suddenly my well water was contaminated, according to county inspectors who never actually tested it. Sarah Martinez, a retired teacher whose cabin had sheltered 3 generations of her family, produced a folder thick with official persecution. Building violations for a structure that passed inspection 6 months earlier. Property tax reassessment that tripled overnight, all dated within 2 weeks of telling her pharmaceutical highness to go pound sand. The conspiracy pattern was clearer than mountain air after a thunderstorm. Ruby's nuclear contribution made everyone sit straighter. Tribal fishing treaties signed in 1862 give us veto power over any development affecting water quality. That pharmaceutical vulture never contacted us, making every permit she obtained federally invalid from day one. As we orchestrated our legal symphony around dancing flames, I felt pieces clicking together with the satisfaction of a perfectly assembled rifle. Vivian had spent months believing she was bullying a shell-shocked veteran with limited resources. What she'd actually accomplished was uniting a community of property owners who understood that stopping her meant protecting every rural area in America from being strip-mined by pharmaceutical millionaires. Maggie outlined our timeline with military precision. Federal investigators Monday morning, tribal treaty complaints Tuesday, environmental protests demanding prosecution by Wednesday. The beauty, she explained through cigarette smoke that mixed with pine fragrance like incense in nature's cathedral, is that each legal action amplifies the others. Federal prosecutors cream their pants over cases combining environmental crimes, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. By midnight, assignments were distributed like ammunition before a battle. Tom would coordinate environmental media coverage. Sarah would organize affected property owners for interviews. Ruby would manage tribal legal warfare, and I would serve as federal investigator liaison. But our planning session's most satisfying revelation was understanding how Vivian's pharmaceutical fraud conviction made prosecution inevitable. Medicare criminals face enhanced scrutiny in any subsequent investigation. Her environmental crimes would look like criminal behavior patterns rather than expensive mistakes. The haunting call of loons across pristine water, finally audible without construction cacophony, sounded like nature itself was blessing our alliance. Maggie stubbed out her final cigarette and grinned like a prosecutor who just discovered smoking gun evidence. That pharmaceutical princess picked the wrong mountain man, the wrong wilderness, and definitely the wrong legal system to screw with. Federal environmental law doesn't accept bribes, and it's about to teach her that some wars can't be bought. Vivian Sterling Hayes was about to discover that David hadn't just brought a slingshot. He'd brought federal prosecutors, tribal treaty rights, and environmental laws with teeth sharp enough to devour pharmaceutical fortunes. Monday morning brought federal investigators and Vivian Sterling Hayes' complete psychological collapse, delivered with the precision of a pharmaceutical overdose, designed to destroy everything she'd spent millions building. The FBI convoy arrived at dawn, like Judgment Day, with government plates. 6 black SUVs rolled into our quiet mountain community with the authority of federal law enforcement coming to collect environmental criminals. Special Agent Maria Santos emerged from the lead vehicle, carrying the kind of expression that had sent pharmaceutical executives to federal prison for the past decade and a half. By 6:30 a.m., Vivian's construction site was wrapped in yellow crime scene tape that fluttered in the mountain breeze like surrender flags, and her workers were being interviewed about the illegal dumping orders they'd received from their pharmaceutical heiress employer. Vivian's response was swift, panicked, and criminally idiotic. She hired Marcus Webb, a sleazy private investigator from Billings, who specialized in opposition research, and looked like he'd been kicked out of mall security for excessive force. Webb started harassing my former Army colleagues, fishing for combat trauma stories, disciplinary actions, or anything that could paint me as an unstable veteran with credibility problems. When that expedition yielded nothing but testimonials about my reliability under pressure, Vivian escalated to direct sabotage that reeked of desperate pharmaceutical executive thinking. My truck tires were slashed while I was having coffee with Ruby at Murphy's Diner, where the smell of bacon grease and honest conversation provided sanctuary from Vivian's manufactured chaos. Security cameras around Hank's cabin were spray-painted blind. Conveniently, during the same week federal investigators were documenting environmental crimes. The harassment peaked when anonymous complaints flooded county offices about my property creating fire hazards and public safety threats. County Inspector Morris, the same bureaucratic puppet who'd approved Vivian's fraudulent permits, appeared at my door, sweating through his uniform like a man delivering his own arrest warrant. "Mr. McCall," he stammered, avoiding eye contact while consulting paperwork that smelled like fresh printer ink. "We've received multiple complaints about septic system violations potentially contaminating groundwater." The irony was thicker than wet concrete. Vivian's construction had been poisoning Crystal Lake for months, but somehow my legally installed 1987 septic system posed an environmental threat requiring immediate, expensive repairs. But Vivian's most revealing moment of desperation came during a recorded phone call that exposed her pharmaceutical sociopathy, like an X-ray revealing cancer. Thanks to Montana's one-party consent laws, a legal nugget Maggie had taught me during our late-night strategy sessions, I legally recorded every word of Vivian's attempted bribery. Bryson, her voice carried the brittle confidence of someone accustomed to buying solutions to inconvenient problems. "Let's discuss this situation like educated adults. I'm prepared to offer $800,000 cash for you to relocate somewhere more appropriate for your particular needs." The offer came wrapped in threats disguised as concern, like poison in pharmaceutical packaging. "I know Emily's been questioning your stability since your overseas deployment," Vivian continued, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I have relationships with family court personnel who understand that combat veterans sometimes require professional intervention to successfully reintegrate into civilian society." She'd researched my ex-wife's custody concerns and was threatening to weaponize my military service against my relationship with my 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. "It would be tragic if your daughter's welfare became collateral damage in this unfortunate misunderstanding," she said, each word calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. That's when I realized Vivian Sterling Hayes wasn't just a criminal. She was a sociopath, willing to destroy a veteran's family relationships to protect her pharmaceutical fortune. Here's the mini twist that made my blood sing with anticipation. While Vivian was busy threatening my personal life, her own contractor was busy destroying hers. Pete Morrison, foreman of Morrison Construction, had recorded every conversation where Vivian ordered illegal dumping. When he'd initially refused to dump concrete washout directly into protected wetlands, she'd screamed threats that revealed her true nature. "Listen, you small-town hick," her voice on Morrison's recording was pure pharmaceutical executive venom. "Either you follow my instructions exactly, or I'll sue your pathetic company into bankruptcy and ensure you never work construction again in this backward state." Morrison's recordings provided federal prosecutors with evidence of criminal conspiracy to violate environmental laws, complete with Vivian's voice ordering specific crimes. Even more devastating, FBI financial analysts had traced wire transfers from Vivian's accounts to County Commissioner Dale Hutchins' shell company, $50,000 in consulting fees for services never performed, payments that coincided perfectly with permit approvals that had enabled her illegal construction. The corruption network was imploding like a controlled demolition. That evening, breathing mountain air that finally carried the clean scent of pine needles instead of diesel exhaust and concrete dust. I stood on Hank's porch, listening to blessed silence where construction equipment used to grind through the night. Federal marshals had seized all machinery as evidence in the environmental crimes investigation. Maggie Blair called with an update that made me smile like a wolf spotting wounded prey. "Honey, that pharmaceutical princess just made the biggest mistake of her entitled life. Threatening a veteran's child while under federal investigation? Federal prosecutors are going to eat her alive and ask for seconds." Wednesday morning delivered Vivian Sterling Hayes' final desperate gambit, with all the subtlety of a pharmaceutical commercial, promising miracle cures while listing deadly side effects in rapid-fire whispers. The FBI had been watching her for 72 hours, and Vivian's response was to double down on corruption with the reckless confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for buying her way out of problems. Her first move was attempting to bribe County Assessor Linda Walsh into declaring my property structurally condemned due to foundational instabilities that would require immediate demolition. The meeting took place at the country club's wine bar, where the clink of crystal glasses mixed with the sound of a pharmaceutical heiress digging her own legal grave. What Vivian didn't know was that Linda Walsh had been cooperating with federal investigators since Monday, wearing a wire that captured every word of the attempted bribery. "Linda, sweetheart," Vivian's voice on the FBI recording dripped with pharmaceutical executive entitlement. "I'm prepared to fund a complete renovation of the county assessor's office. New computers, updated software, maybe even a salary bonus for exceptional public service." The quid pro quo was crystal clear. Condemn Bryson McCall's property, and the assessor's office would receive $100,000 in anonymous donations from grateful taxpayers. But Vivian wasn't finished destroying her own life. She offered County Commissioner Dale Hutchins an additional $150,000 to expedite emergency zoning changes that would reclassify the entire lake area as recreational commercial development, effectively overriding all environmental protections. The second FBI recording captured Hutchins' enthusiastic acceptance. "Vivian, you're talking about the kind of visionary development this county needs. I'm sure we can fast-track those zoning adjustments through emergency procedures." While Vivian was busy bribing local officials, her desperation reached new depths of criminal stupidity. She attempted to pressure First Montana Bank into foreclosing on properties owned by coalition members who'd refused her buyout offers. The bank president, terrified of federal money laundering investigations, immediately contacted FBI financial crimes investigators and provided documentation of Vivian's attempts to manipulate mortgage lending decisions through her ex-husband's board position. But here's the mini twist that transformed Vivian from predator to prey. Her own contractor became a federal whistleblower who destroyed her empire from within. Pete Morrison had endured months of Vivian's abuse, threats, and orders to commit environmental crimes. When FBI agents offered him immunity in exchange for cooperation, he provided them with a treasure trove of evidence that would have made Al Capone's prosecutors weep with joy. Morrison's documentation included recorded conversations of Vivian ordering illegal dumping, financial records showing payments for falsifying environmental permits, email correspondence discussing bribes to county officials, photographs of deliberate environmental destruction Vivian had ordered to eliminate protected species habitat. "She told me to kill every mussel I could find," Morrison's sworn affidavit stated with the precision of a federal indictment. Said endangered species were just bureaucratic obstacles that needed to be eliminated permanently. The environmental massacre wasn't accidental. It was systematic habitat destruction designed to remove legal barriers to commercial development. Thursday morning brought the media explosion that Vivian had been dreading since federal agents first appeared at her construction site. The Montana Environmental Gazette broke the story with a headline that probably made pharmaceutical executives choke on their organic, fair trade coffee. Pharmaceutical heiress bribes officials for illegal mansion built on stolen land. The article detailed every aspect of Vivian's criminal conspiracy, from Medicare fraud background to systematic environmental destruction, illustrated with photographs of dead wildlife and poisoned lake water that made environmental activists sharpen their pitchforks. Regional television news crews descended on Crystal Lake like media locusts, covering a pharmaceutical disaster. interviewing federal agents, environmental scientists, and local property owners who'd suffered under Vivian's harassment campaigns. But the most devastating blow came when structural engineers hired by the state declared Vivian's $2.8 million mansion uninhabitable and potentially dangerous due to foundation damage caused by illegal limestone excavation that had destabilized the underlying geology. Her pharmaceutical palace was literally sinking into the earth like a concrete Titanic, and county building inspectors ordered immediate evacuation pending demolition assessments. That evening, I stood on Hank's porch, watching news helicopters circle Vivian's condemned mansion like mechanical vultures, their rotor wash carrying the sweet scent of pine needles, finally free from diesel contamination. Ruby Blackwater called with news that made victory taste sweeter than mountain honey. Tribal Council voted unanimously to file federal civil rights violations against everyone involved in this conspiracy. Treaty violations carry criminal penalties that make environmental crimes look like parking tickets. The corruption network that Vivian had spent months building was collapsing faster than her illegally constructed mansion. Federal prosecutors had documented systematic bribery, environmental destruction, and civil rights violations that would keep pharmaceutical executives in orange jumpsuits for decades. Maggie Blair's evening phone call delivered the final nail in Vivian's pharmaceutical coffin. "Honey, that woman's looking at federal racketeering charges under RICO statutes. She didn't just commit crimes. She ran a criminal organization. Federal prosecutors are treating this like organized crime, with environmental terrorism sprinkled on top." Vivian Sterling Hayes had spent $2.8 million building her dream mansion on stolen land. But what she'd actually constructed was the most expensive federal crime scene in Montana history. The county commission meeting on Friday evening packed 247 people into a room designed for 50, creating an atmosphere thick with righteous fury and the sweaty tension of corruption, finally being exposed under fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. Federal agents lined the back wall like a law enforcement firing squad, their presence transforming a routine county meeting into a public tribunal that would determine whether small-town corruption could survive federal scrutiny. Local and regional media crews turned the front of the room into a television studio, their camera lights harsh enough to make guilty county officials squirm, like pharmaceutical executives testifying before Congress about price-gouging cancer medications. Vivian Sterling Hayes made her entrance fashionably late, flanked by a legal team that looked like they'd been airlifted from a corporate defense firm's emergency response unit. Released on $500,000 federal bail, she wore designer armor disguised as a conservative business suit, but her eyes carried the desperate gleam of a pharmaceutical executive watching stock prices crater. County Commissioner Dale Hutchins called the meeting to order, with hands that trembled like autumn leaves, his voice carrying the authority of someone reading his own political obituary. "We're here to address concerns about recent development projects around Crystal Lake," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with the federal agents, whose presence had transformed his corruption kingdom into a criminal evidence warehouse. I stood to present evidence that would detonate Vivian's empire, like a controlled demolition designed to clear space for justice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have audio recordings, financial documents, and environmental reports that prove systematic criminal conspiracy involving bribery, environmental destruction, and civil rights violations." The crowd erupted with the kind of anger that builds in small communities when pharmaceutical money tries to buy their natural heritage. Vivian's response was to launch into a performance worthy of a pharmaceutical commercial, promising miraculous results while hiding deadly side effects in the fine print. "These accusations are nothing more than environmental terrorism, perpetrated by a mentally unstable veteran who can't accept that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions," she declared, her voice carrying the manufactured confidence of someone accustomed to buying favorable outcomes. She claimed to be the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign designed to prevent legitimate business development that would benefit the entire community. Ruby Blackwater's testimony delivered the first devastating blow to Vivian's pharmaceutical fantasy. Standing with the dignity of someone whose family had protected these waters for generations, Ruby presented 150 years of documented tribal stewardship, complete with treaty rights that predated Montana statehood and superseded any local development permits. "My great-great-grandfather signed fishing treaties with the U.S. government in 1862, Ruby's voice carried the weight of federal law that couldn't be bribed or intimidated. Any development affecting water quality requires tribal consultation that never occurred, making every permit this woman obtained federally invalid. EPA Regional Director Maria Santos took the podium like a federal prosecutor, presenting evidence to a grand jury. She read a list of environmental violations that sounded like charges in a war crimes tribunal: systematic destruction of endangered species habitat, illegal dumping of toxic construction materials, falsification of environmental impact assessments, and conspiracy to eliminate protected wetlands through deliberate contamination. Mrs. Sterling Hayes' construction project has violated 23 separate federal environmental statutes, Santos announced, her words falling like judges' gavels on Vivian's pharmaceutical dreams. Total fines and remediation costs exceed $4.2 million. Pete Morrison's testimony provided the smoking gun that transforms civil violations into criminal conspiracy. She ordered me to kill every endangered mussel I could find, Morrison stated under oath, his voice steady as someone finally telling truth after months of being forced to commit environmental crimes. When I objected, she threatened to bankrupt my company and destroy my family's livelihood. Morrison produced recordings of Vivian ordering specific environmental crimes, complete with threats against anyone who refused to participate in her systematic habitat destruction. But the moment that destroyed Vivian's pharmaceutical empire forever came when Maggie Blair presented the original 1987 property deed with its reversion clause. Your Honor, Mrs. Sterling Hayes built her mansion on land that legally reverted to county ownership the moment she began commercial operations, Maggie announced with the satisfaction of someone playing a royal flush in a game where everyone else held losing hands. Her social media marketing of Sterling Hayes' estate as a corporate retreat venue triggered the reversion clause, making her a trespasser on county property who owes $2.8 million in improvements to land she never legally owned. The courtroom erupted with the sound of justice being served at pharmaceutical temperature. Vivian's meltdown was spectacular and immediate. This is a conspiracy of environmental extremists and small-town losers who can't appreciate visionary development, she screamed, her pharmaceutical executive composure finally cracking like a defective medication capsule. I'm improving this backwards wasteland, and you people are too ignorant to recognize progress. Sheriff Peterson, no longer protecting his tennis partner, approached with handcuffs as Vivian continued her pharmaceutical tirade, accusing the judge of being bought off by tree-hugging terrorists. The mic drop moment came when Judge Harrison Mills announced the court's decision with the finality of a pharmaceutical recall notice. Mrs. Sterling Hayes, your mansion is ordered demolished within 30 days. All permits are permanently revoked, and this court recommends federal prosecution for criminal conspiracy, environmental terrorism, and civil rights violations. 6 months later, Crystal Lake looked like nature's own pharmaceutical miracle, a wilderness ecosystem healing itself after systematic poisoning, with water so clear you could count trout swimming 20 feet below the surface where Vivian's illegal dock used to contaminate protected wetlands. The demolition of Sterling Hayes' estate had been completed in record time, with materials recycled into affordable housing for veterans through a federal environmental remediation program that turned pharmaceutical crime scenes into community resources. Vivian herself had accepted a plea bargain to avoid trial, receiving 3 years in federal prison plus $3.2 million in restitution for environmental damage, legal costs, and community restoration programs. Her pharmaceutical fortune had been methodically dismantled by federal asset forfeiture proceedings that treated environmental crimes like the organized criminal activity they represented. County Commissioner Dale Hutchins was serving 18 months in federal prison for accepting bribes, while 3 other county officials faced corruption charges that had transformed local government from a pharmaceutical money laundering operation into something resembling actual public service. The Crystal Lake Preservation Alliance had evolved from our emergency coalition into a permanent conservation organization with federal recognition and funding to protect rural communities from pharmaceutical-style development invasions. But the most satisfying transformation was personal and community-wide. I'd used part of the federal restitution money to restore Hank's Fishing Lodge as an environmental education center where school groups could learn about ecosystem protection and veterans could find peaceful sanctuary in wilderness that would never again face pharmaceutical colonization. The lodge's main hall featured photographs documenting our legal victory, alongside displays about treaty rights, environmental law, and the importance of community organizing against corporate criminals who mistake rural areas for pharmaceutical testing grounds. Ruby Blackwater's Tribal Council had established a co-management agreement with the state environmental agency, creating the Crystal Lake Traditional Knowledge Partnership that combined indigenous wisdom with modern conservation science to protect water quality for future generations. The partnership employed former military personnel in ecosystem restoration work, providing meaningful careers for veterans who understood the value of protecting something worth defending. My personal life had healed alongside the lake ecosystem. Emily, my ex-wife, had witnessed Vivian's harassment campaign and my response with growing respect that eventually rebuilt our co-parenting relationship into something stronger than our marriage had ever been. Sophie's proud of her dad for protecting Grandpa Hank's legacy, Emily told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings that no longer carried the bitter aftertaste of custody disputes. She understands now that some fights are worth having. 8-year-old Sophie had become the lodge's youngest environmental educator, leading tours for visitors who wanted to understand how ordinary people could defeat pharmaceutical corruption through community organizing and federal environmental law. The regional economic impact had exceeded everyone's expectations, except possibly Vivian's nightmares in federal prison. Ecotourism had replaced pharmaceutical development as the area's primary economic driver, bringing visitors who spent money supporting local businesses rather than extracting natural resources for pharmaceutical executives who lived elsewhere. The Crystal Lake Environmental Scholarship provided $100,000 annually for local students studying conservation, environmental law, or sustainable development, funding that came directly from Vivian's forfeited pharmaceutical assets. The Veterans Conservation Corps employed 30 former military personnel in ecosystem restoration projects throughout Montana, proving that environmental protection and veteran employment could create lasting economic benefits for rural communities. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the transformation of our community's relationship with power and corruption. People who'd felt helpless against pharmaceutical money and county corruption had learned they possessed federal law, treaty rights, and community solidarity that could defeat any amount of pharmaceutical wealth when properly organized and legally deployed. The story had attracted national media attention, inspiring similar community organizing efforts in rural areas facing development pressure from pharmaceutical money and other forms of corporate colonization. Maggie Blair, now 81 and still smoking cigarettes that could power small aircraft, had received recognition from the Montana State Bar for her role in exposing corruption that reached from county commissioners to pharmaceutical executives. "Honey," she told me during our celebration dinner at Murphy's Diner, where the smell of honest food mixed with the satisfaction of justice properly served. Rich folks always think they can buy their way out of consequences. This case proved that federal environmental law doesn't accept pharmaceutical bribes. Standing on the dock I'd rebuilt, where Vivian's illegal construction once poisoned pristine water, breathing mountain air that carried only pine and wildflower scents, I felt the deep satisfaction of promises kept to family and community. Hank's wilderness would remain wild and free forever, protected by federal law and tribal treaties that no amount of pharmaceutical money could corrupt. What started as one veteran defending his inheritance had become a community victory that proved ordinary people could defeat extraordinary corruption when they understood their power and used it wisely. Ready to see entitled wealth get demolished again? Drop your worst HOA horror story in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of regular folks beating corrupt systems. Ring that notification bell so you never miss justice being served.